Many of you probably will not realize how strange this is, and you're probably not going to believe that sometimes I can be a little bit of an odd person, do things a little differently or think differently or act differently than some folks might expect. And when I was getting ready to graduate from Mississippi College, I was looking around at seminaries, and if you don't know, the standard seminary that most folks go to from this area is New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, one of the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries in the U.S. And for some reason, I was looking at other churches, and I had a couple professors ask me, "Why are you going to that school?" Or why'd you decide to go to, and I went to McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University. And, typically to avoid answering such questions that I really don't know the entire answer to and don't really feel like getting into it, I just resort to my normal flippant response, and that was they gave me a full scholarship. Probably shouldn't have, but they did. I'm sure they still regret that to this day. And the truth of the matter is I haven't really known how to respond to most people. For some, it's that saying simply that that's where I felt like God was leading me to go was very true. But it was difficult to know how or why. To some respect, there was Alan Culpepper was there. And he was actually the dean of the school, and he is probably one of the most knowledgeable New Testament scholars, especially in Southern Baptist tradition and Southern Baptist life, and particularly on the Gospel of John. And I said, well, you know what? He's just very brilliant, very smart, and learn a lot from him. And I did. But looking back, in the words of someone else who was there, another teacher who was there, it told me, you know what? Sometimes you find those people that just embody a certain amount of grace, a certain amount of peace. And it seems like they're so knowledgeable about the Bible, about the New Testament. It's not something that, yes, they can talk about all day long, but you just see it in the way they live. Because God has changed and transformed their lives in some amazing ways. And what it really comes down to, looking back, I did not know this at the time, didn't know it until recent years. I think that's where God kind of directed me for that purpose. I don't know about you, but so often, first of all, I need that, but so often it feels like, you know what, I'm supposed to have a handle on life. You would think that after 12 years of being a full-time pastor, I would have a little bit more of a grasp on how to do it more effectively and be better at it. You would think that sometimes it seems like no matter how much we learn, no matter how much we grow, there's still this place in our lives where when we see who Jesus is and who Jesus was, and we see who we are and who we're not, that somehow we wonder, how in the world will we ever become who and what God has called us to be? And one of the interesting things that's amazed me, from the time I was a little kid, I enjoyed reading the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Last week we looked at how God created this beautiful world. This world without sin, this world without death, this world without pain, without sorrow, without grief, until Adam and Eve kind of ate of the fruit. And then there's this problem between them and God and them and one another. And the reason we still have problems with God and the reason we have problems with one another is because of the sin in our lives. And that is so true. But one of the things that amazes me the most about the stories of Genesis, and from the time I was a little kid, I always felt like there was something more drawing me even closer than I could ever imagine. I remember one of the first memories that I have was God just calling Abram. It's not like he grew up in church or whatever else, but it's like God called Abram and he said, listen, I come to this land and all this kind of stuff, and it intrigued me. Why would someone do that? It's not like he grew up in church. It's not like he grew up knowing God. There still was no church. There was still no Israel. There was still nothing. And somehow Abram spent his whole life waiting for God to fulfill the promise that never was really completed, even in its infancy, by the time he was dead. And how in the world did he have that kind of faith? I remember seeing the images, and it was a little disturbing the first time I saw them, but the images in Sunday school when I learned, when they would teach about Abraham going and sacrificing Isaac on the altar, the child that they waited for over and over and over again. For years they waited for him. And God just says, and Abraham just tells Isaac, Isaac's sitting there wondering, hey, we got the wood, we got the knife, we got a rope. I'm not sure why it's on my waist right now, but where is the lamb? Where's the sacrifice? And Abram just responds, oh, God will provide. Is that just Abram dodging the question or experiencing great faith? Maybe both. Because there are times in our lives, right, where we think that we're supposed to be doing something, but we don't really see how it is going to play itself out in life day after day after day. Trusting that God will just work itself out. It'd be years before I'd look back and read things like where Paul says in Romans 1, where Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. And I'm like, yeah, but it's a lot more fun to read a story than a statement like that, because that statement is a summary of Abraham's life, it seems like. But of all the good stuff, you notice that we have this tendency sometimes, if we love someone or we know someone, there's this tendency sometimes to see all their good and not their bad. If you don't ever recognize that, just look in the mirror and you can probably see that sometimes, right? I mean, there are these moments where it's so easy to say, oh, I could do this and I could do this. And then all of a sudden it's like, ooh, my, something knocks us down and we're like, oh, goodness, I'm not quite as good as I thought. I'm not quite as effective as I thought. And looking back at Abraham's life, I mean, there were great moments of faith. I mean, God told Abraham that he was going to have a child, and he did. And then he said, listen, it's not going to be Ishmael and Hagar, that do whatever you're going to, but that don't do whatever you're going to. That's not what I meant. You did whatever you were going to. Not saying that you should do whatever. Anyway, moving on. And whatever, but that's not the promised child. That route that you took, maybe it's a common social practice, but that's not the way it's going to happen. It's going to be with Sarah. Abraham waits another decade or two. God, it still hadn't happened. And then by the time, I didn't realize this for years, but I mean, she was postmenopausal at this point, and God tells Abraham, listen, I'm going to do that, and this time next year, I'm going to be here, and you and Sarah are going to have a child. And Abraham believed God for the most part, but he just Couldn't see it. Just like with Isaac on the altar. It's just, I'm not sure what's going to happen. Likewise, Sarah, she just laughed, which is a whole nother story. Her response is pretty entertaining. And I'm just going to be honest with you. I mean, we don't have anybody in here 90 years old, I don't think, or 89 years old right now. But, you know, the personalization, it seems so ludicrous sometimes. Y'all, if God told me I was going to have another child, I would probably just fall out dead. I'm just being honest with you. I love my kids. My kids are a joy and they're a blessing, but 3 is enough. Megan says 4 is enough. She's talking about me being the 4th, not having. Never mind, moving on. That attempt at self-deprecation just backfired. And then you look back, and yes, there were moments where they kind of laughed and they kind of mocked. And then there are moments where Abraham, he believed God, and it was one of those big things. God was saying, listen, I want you to leave your family and travel for weeks and months and go to this land that you haven't seen, that you haven't heard from, and I'm going to give it to you and your descendants. And he went. Sometimes those big things in life are easy to follow God in, right? Because we recognize their value. We recognize their importance. Sometimes we recognize that, you know what? I know that it is up to me to make the right decision here. And sometimes those are the easiest decisions to make. But then sometimes it's when things don't quite turn out the way that we thought they would, when we get to the land where God has promised us and there's a famine and we're like, listen, we got to eat somehow. Let's go to Egypt. But see, then there's this thing where we have this great faith, but then fear can always just raise its ugly head. And we can say things like, let's just say you're my brother so that Pharaoh won't kill me to take you. There are these moments of brilliant faith, right? And then these moments where he was so lacked faith and trust in God. And sometimes it's easy for us to look back and say, you know what? He was so full of faith and yet he was so faithless, and we see their faults and their failures. But you see, we forget something. The thing that amazes me the most is we forget one of the most important things. God does not exist in this world. This whole notion of time is a construct of God's creation. We only think of time. I know this is, I'm talking about things way beyond my comprehension, and I realize that. But we think of when we've been there 10,000 years. Remember that one, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've no less days to sing God's grace than when we first begun. And there, the song Amazing Grace talks about how long that is, but the reality of it is when all is said and done, our life on earth is shaped by time. But when Jesus returns and the earth is no more and the creation is no more, at least not in the way that God created it so long ago, when that exists no longer, time does not exist. And God still sees you and me. What does that mean? God sees before you were born and after you're dead. You see, God's portrait of us is not shaped like ours is. We think, oh, that person did such a wonderful job. Oh, that person hurt my feelings. You know what? I feel like I have completely messed up right here and right now. But when God looks back into our lives, God does not see things the way we see things. He's already told us that. My ways are not your ways, and everything else. And so what we see when Paul says things like, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. That is God's perspective. Because God sees who we are. Not like we've never sinned. We say things trying to justify and explain all these things about sin. And we say justified means just as if I'd never sinned. Folks, that is ludicrous. That is not the way. Now, God does say, listen, as far as the east is from the west, and they never meet, so far as He removes His sins from us, it's not just as if He's never sinned, just as if I've ever sinned, because the reality of life is that we do sin, we do make mistakes, and we are accountable to those mistakes. There are consequences for those sins. What that means, though, is it's not that Jesus just forgets anything. It's not that God just forgets our sins, but rather it's that Jesus is there and paid for our sins. And it's not like He's on the cross and can't see our sins because they've been paid for, but He's on the cross seeing our sins and recognizing who we are from the time we are born, before we are a speck in our parents' eyes, till long after we are dead. God sees everything. And that everything is much more than how we feel right here, right now. It includes those moments of brilliant faith and trust in God. And it includes those moments where we fell short. And God's grace is there anyway. I love the people around me, not because I think they're perfect, but because I recognize their faults and failures, just like they see mine. And I love them anyway, in spite of it. Because I see how loving and compassionate they can be. Full of grace and mercy, full of creativity and thoughtfulness. Full of hope and mercy. And even times where people take after other people and they're smart alecks. I can't imagine why anybody would ever be a smart aleck. And you know what? You know what? The thing that amazes me the most about the stories that we read about in Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob, the father of Israel, do y'all realize that he was a mischievous, weaseling, conniving? Trickster is a nice way of saying it. I mean, he wrote the book on how to weasel your way into or out of a situation. Just read the stories about Jacob. I mean, continually doing that. But God used him. You realize that Isaac did the same stuff, showed the same faith, but also the same lack of faith in the same way about going to Egypt when there was a famine and saying, hey, Pharaoh, this is my sister. He did the same thing that his daddy did. But you see, the thing is those moments where God sees into what we call eternity what God sees as reality, but what we call eternity, and he sees it all. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. What amazing faith. How great is the God that does that? And you know the thing that amazes me even more? Is when God called Abraham. He was Abram at the time. God called Abram. Abram wasn't who he was supposed to be. When Abram died, or then it was Abraham, when he died, he wasn't who he was supposed to be. By the way, did you realize that Abraham had many, many children? Like after Sarah died, he married Talua, and they had kids, and he fathered many nations just in and of himself. And here's the catch. Not the catch. Here's the deal. God calls you, and God calls me, just as he called Abraham. It doesn't matter how great we are, how wonderful we think we are, or how horrible we think we are. No matter how wealthy, no matter how poor, no matter how righteous, no matter how sinful, no matter how old or how young, whether we have a day left on this earth, a decade, or a century, God's call on our life is there. And God sees. God sees. And he sees not only the good, not only the bad. God sees it all. And his call is there anyway. We are not perfect. Even when we follow Jesus, we are not perfect. At times we are reminded about that. It seems like constantly. Neither was Abraham, neither was Isaac, neither was Jacob, neither was Joseph, neither was David, neither were all these other people. Sometimes I wish we could learn to see ourselves first and each other secondly, the way God sees us. Yes, as people who make mistakes all the time, but as people who are not only living for God, but as people whom God is transforming to be more like himself. And I'm here to tell you today that God has been doing that in your life and will continue to do so. My hope and prayer is that you will surrender and follow him.